Well, thank you very much, James, for that very warm introduction, which proves that not all forms of inflation are painful. So thank you. I also want to thank you for inviting me here today. I realized that I didn't pack any suntan lotion. I didn't realize I would need that. So thank you also for the wonderful weather. And what I'd like to do is begin by doing what academics do best, I suppose. And that is, of course, engage in some shameless self-promotion. And I apologize in advance for setting the world's record for the most logos on a single slide. But there are some institutions that I would like to promote. This is an ideal audience in which to promote them. The first is the Technology Transfer Society, which you might not be aware of, but it is a nonprofit organization that is devoted to the academic analysis of the managerial and policy implications of technology transfer, commercialization, academic entrepreneurship. And the society really does two things. We host an annual research conference, which some of you have attended. And this conference has taken place at such diverse venues as the Kaufman Foundation in Kansas City, Georgia Tech in Atlanta, the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Last year, for the first time, we hosted the conference in Europe at the University of Augsburg in Germany. And on November 2nd and November 3rd, we'll be hosting the conference in New York City for the first time at the New York Academy of Sciences. So if you are interested in papers that deal with the issues that will be considered over the next 2 days, then I encourage you to attend that conference. I'd also like to point out that our keynote speakers for the conference in November will be William Baumol of New York University and David Teese from the University of California at Berkeley. The second thing that the Society does is we have an academic journal called the Journal of Technology Transfer. So those of you who've submitted to the conference today should consider the Journal of Technology Transfer as a publication outlet. We are in the Social Science Citation Index. We have an impact factor of 1.2, and we're starting to appear on some of the important lists. So it's a very useful publication outlet and also contains a lot of articles that are of great practical interest to industry and government. So I encourage you to look at that. The final act of self-promotion is promoting the Academy of Management Perspectives, which we took over last year. The Academy of Management Perspectives is published by the Academy of Management, which has over 20,000 members. And we are also interested in publishing papers on the subject of academic entrepreneurship in that journal. So I would encourage you, the academics in the crowd, the PhD students, to think about the publication outlets that I mentioned. So again, that's my shameless self-promotion. I thought I would start out with some background information, since I realize that many people in the room are not familiar with some of the issues surrounding academic entrepreneurship. Then I will attempt to try to summarize what is a burgeoning interdisciplinary literature on academic entrepreneurship, provide some lessons learned for academics and policymakers and industry. And since I know that there are many junior faculty present and PhD students, try to identify some unanswered research questions that you could potentially address in some of the publication outlets I mentioned and others. Now, I'd like to start out by saying that I was attracted to the subject of innovation when I became exposed to the work of Joseph Schumpeter. So I'm gonna start out here with a little theory. And I guess I have to do that because I was trained as an academic economist. And Ronald Reagan once said that an economist is someone who, upon observing that something works in practice, wonders whether it works in theory. So I always have to start out with a little bit of theory. And what attracted me from a theoretical perspective about innovation was the work of Joseph Schumpeter. And what made Schumpeter so unique among academic economists, and I'll bet everyone in this room has taken courses in economics, and you know that there's a great emphasis on competition. It's really the study of markets. And typically, you spend 99% of the semester talking about price competition, when in fact what Schumpeter said is really important is, from a policy perspective and also from a firm's perspective, is competition through innovation. And he was really the first to stress the importance of that. And also talk about the role of the entrepreneur and how the entrepreneur and the innovator stimulates what he called creative destruction, which means the displacement of old technologies by new technologies, and that's how you create a dynamic and growing economy. And I also had the good fortune as a graduate student and then as a postdoc to be exposed to three great economists who studied innovation and really understood the importance of it. And the three economists were Zvi Grilikus, Edwin Mansfield, and Richard Nelson, who was my dissertation chairman. And they studied the diffusion of innovation. They quantified, most importantly, I think, the impact of innovation on firm performance, but most importantly, on economic performance more generally. That this is a critical source of economic growth and competitiveness, and also talked about the role of the university. So I come to this subject because I was able to study with these great economists who understood the importance of innovation and entrepreneurship. Now, I'd also like to say, because I was asked to address this point, why does all this matter? Well, economists have also talked about the role of what they call general purpose technologies. So general purpose technologies are technologies like the steam engine, electricity, computers and the internet, laser technology, biotechnology, and we think nanotechnology, which have widespread uses in downstream sectors, but also, and perhaps most importantly, lead to the creation of new industries and new economic activity. And almost all of these general purpose technologies were developed at universities. So getting these policies right, understanding the linkages between universities and industries, is so important from an economic perspective because of the role of general purpose technologies. Now, a little more history for you, which I think is important to underscore, and that is the fact that there were major changes in national innovation policy. And where did these changes emerge? How did these changes emerge? It goes back to the days, and again, I'm talking about the US context, but it really applies in a global context as well. It started in the 1970s, which was a bleak period for the US economy. And there were really two pernicious trends at the time, at least on the part of policymakers viewed as being pernicious. The first was the productivity slowdown, which was caused in part by the energy shocks of the 1970s. And then, at the time, there was great concern about the so-called Japanese challenge. At the time, the Japanese were capturing global market share from United States companies in key high technology industries. And this is reminiscent of the kind of concerns that we have today about China. But at that time, Japan was the threat. So as a result of these two pernicious trends, there emerged a bipartisan consensus, and I stress that, bipartisan support for three major changes in national innovation policy. The first was the creation of public-private partnerships to support innovation and in particular to support the competitiveness of high-tech companies. And these included initiatives such as, and I apologize for all these acronyms on the board, I'll explain them. The National Science Foundation, which traditionally had just sponsored basic research, was now supporting programs to link industries and universities through engineering research centers, industry university cooperative research centers, and other initiatives. The second was relaxation of antitrust enforcement with respect to collaborative research. So previously, the government had discouraged firms from colluding on the basis of research. Now they were actually encouraging firms to engage in research joint ventures, strategic alliances, and even specific consortium designed to promote industry research. Semitech, for example, and other types of industry consortia. Third, policies to promote the more rapid diffusion of innovations from universities and national laboratories, federal labs, to the marketplace, including legislation like the Bayh-Dole Act, which was bipartisan legislation, Stevenson-Weidler, also bipartisan, to promote the more rapid dissemination of technologies from universities to the private sector. The legislation that has attracted the most attention, both domestically and globally, is the Bayh-Dole Act, which dramatically changed the rules of the game in terms of intellectual property rights at universities. So universities would now be able to own the intellectual property that arises from federal research grants and could commercialize their intellectual property. And that has really led to a dramatic increase in the commercialization of intellectual property at universities in America and across the world, as other countries have adopted Bayh-Dole-like legislation. So we've seen a rapid rise in patenting, in licensing, and in commercialization and startups at universities, as universities become intellectual property portfolio managers, essentially. And the numbers reflect that. Now, not surprisingly, this has attracted a considerable amount of attention in academia. You may not know it to look at me, but I am a member of a cult. And that is the cult of academics in a variety of social science disciplines, and also fields in business administration and engineering who are studying academic entrepreneurship. And this is a growing cult. It's also, I think, having a tremendous impact on public policy and managerial decision-making as it relates to university-industry relationships and academic entrepreneurship. And I would argue that this literature is both micro and macro. There are some academics who are studying agents involved in academic entrepreneurship, those being scientists and entrepreneurs. And some academics are studying institutions, meaning the centers that I mentioned earlier, engineering research centers, industry cooperative research centers, all of those kinds of centers and institutes that have emerged, as well as universities, technology transfer offices, property-based institutions, which have attracted a substantial amount of private and public investment, either on universities or adjacent to universities, incubators, accelerators, science and technology parks. And others are studying this from the corporate perspective, looking at the corporations who interact with universities, angel investors, venture capital firms, and other private organizations that interact with universities and also with academic entrepreneurs. Lots of interesting research questions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think the most interesting ones, and this may reflect my own disciplinary bias, are those related to performance. How do we conceptualize performance? How do we measure it? Why are some universities doing better than others? How can we explain why some universities do better than others? Is that due to external factors? Is it due to institutional policies? Is it due to organizational practices at the university? Do property-based institutions add value, such as incubators, accelerators, science and technology parks? Lots of interesting research questions. Given the interdisciplinary nature of this literature, there are lots of different measures of output and performance. Given the fact that you're looking at agents and institutions, you have different ways of conceptualizing and measuring performance. Some academics are looking at the commercialization outcomes, invention disclosures, patents, licensing, startups. Others are looking at the outcomes of the startups, the performance of those university-based startups, whether they survive, how they perform, do they go public, lots of different other outcome measures. Some academics are looking very carefully at the research productivity of academic entrepreneurs. Are they publishing? Do they continue to publish? Or is their work being cited? How does entrepreneurial activity affect their scientific productivity? And lots of other different measures of output and performance. Now, I became involved in this, again, this is going back a little bit in history, but I became involved in this through a very interesting program that was sponsored by the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Sloan Foundation, which is a major foundation in America that's devoted to the study of technology. And they decided that it would be a good time, and this is in the 1990s, for economists to get out in the field and do field research, qualitative research. So they sponsored a program called the Project on Industrial Technology and Productivity. And because economists usually we don't talk to our data points, basically. We don't do qualitative research. We rely on the government to collect data. But this initiative was specifically designed to promote qualitative research in the spirit of Adam Smith, you know, visiting the pin factory and learning from that experience and writing one of the greatest books of all time, The Wealth of Nations. Let's get out in the field and do this qualitative research. And by the way, this led to a whole bunch of very interesting research on the economics of organizations and strategy. But we decided, and personnel economics and some other very exciting areas. So qualitative research is very important in this sphere, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And that's what we did. We decided that we would look at technology transfer offices and also do some qualitative work. Now again, I'm trained as an economist, so I tend to think of the whole world as a production function and that you can subsume everything into this production function, and we started out with this grand idea that we could just measure the outputs and the inputs and that would be the end of the story, right? So the idea was we have data and we can collect data on outputs and inputs, but also that once we did this, we would try to explain performance, but also do some qualitative work, do some structured interviews of the key players involved in technology commercialization. If you think about this very broadly, there are three key agents involved in the commercialization of intellectual property at the universities. Who are those agents? One would be the academics and the industry scientists. Sometimes academics work with industry scientists. They are, in my view, the suppliers of technology. Then you have the university administration, which is charged with the responsibility of managing the process. So those would be the producers, in effect. And then you have the firms and the entrepreneurs, who I would view as the customers. They are the agents who commercialize the innovations that are developed at the universities. And we were going to do, and we did, a bunch of these structured interviews. Now, we started out, as most economists would, with a very simple linear model of how a technology is transferred from a university to a firm or an entrepreneur. And it starts out with the discovery, scientific discovery. And again, this is part of a federal research grant. So most scientists at a university are doing funded research through NIH or NSF or whatever the funding agency is. And according to the Bayh-Dole legislation, they have to disclose their invention to the university. Okay? So that's what should happen in theory. They disclose their invention to the Technology Transfer Office, which then evaluates it for patenting, maybe in consultation with faculty committees, decides to patent it, and once the patent is awarded, then the university can market the technology to an existing firm or to a startup that is launched to commercialize the innovation. So we thought, okay, the very simple linear process, this is how it works. Well, guess what? We were wrong. It was a lot more complex than that. We published a bunch of papers on this, on the qualitative work that we did and the quantitative work, and developed some very important stylized facts that are relevant to the study of technology transfer, I think. The first is that patenting is not very important in certain industries or sectors. In engineering and in some forms of engineering, in software and other industries, you don't really need to patent a technology to commercialize. It's very important in the life sciences, but not in some other fields. The second stylized fact, which turns out to be very important in terms of understanding some of the bottlenecks that universities encounter, is that many scientists were not, in fact, disclosing their inventions to the university, and that a lot of technologies were going out the back door. And there have been some very extensive follow-up studies on this problem that universities face when faculty don't disclose their inventions. Now, to me, that highlights the importance of the role of the Technology Transfer Office in eliciting disclosures and making sure that the university has an ample supply of technologies to commercialize. The third stylized fact, which was again confirmed in a lot of other subsequent studies, is that faculty engagement is actually critical, not just in the development of the technology, but in the commercialization. You have to get faculty engaged in this process, the whole 9 yards, not just the initial stages, but also in the commercialization. The fourth is that the universities have to rely on outside lawyers to negotiate agreements with firms and entrepreneurs. So there's a substantial reliance on lawyers to do the negotiations. And then finally, there are, as an economist, it's really simple when you have a single output. The problem is that there are multiple outputs. The universities have different ideas of what they're maximizing, essentially, if you think about it from an analytical standpoint. Some universities stress patenting and licensing, others stress licensing, others stress startups, others care more about sponsored research. And this is what is revealed when you do the interviews of the university administrators. Now again, we were thinking in terms of a production function, which we did specify, saying that there's multiple outputs. The outputs would be licensing and startup activity, and the inputs or the resources that are allocated to this process would be the labor, right, the staff in the Technology Transfer Office. They play a very important role in eliciting disclosures and managing the process. Legal expenses are very important in the negotiation of licenses. And then we have different ways of measuring the pool of available technologies for licensing. We argue that that could be invention disclosures, could be funded research. They're really very, very closely correlated, so it doesn't really matter which one you use. But this is the first stage of the analysis. This will explain the university's output. But there are lots of other factors that play into this process that are outside of the control, some of which are outside of the control of the university. Those would be external factors, environmental factors, that have to do with the region that the firm is located in, perhaps the amount of industrial activity in the region. Institutional factors, which relate to the policies of the university, and also organizational factors, which could be at the university level, the college level, the department level, which are normally not included in a production function. Now, once you go down this road, and a lot of researchers have, after we publish the initial studies, you have to decide how you're going to measure output, how you're going to estimate this production function, and you have several choices. You can use a parametric approach, a non-parametric approach, which means a statistical approach or a linear program, basically. And you could look at different, either single or multiple outputs. Now, I'm going to do what economists do quite normally when confronted with a complex situation. What we do is we make a bunch of assumptions and we subsume the world into a two-dimensional space, right? That's kind of what we do for a living. And what I'll assume now, just to keep it simple and give you an idea of what the intuition is behind this, is say, let's just assume that there's only one output. Let's assume that there's only one input. To keep it simple so we can do the graphical analysis. There's just one technology transfer output and one input. And we have multiple universities who are generating different combinations of inputs and outputs. Well, essentially, you have two choices. If you want to describe the relationship between input and output, you can take the regression approach, right, which is estimating a line parametrically, or you can take the linear programming approach, which is to estimate a frontier. A lot of times that's more useful because you want to do some benchmarking and you want to make some inferences about how you can improve performance. But anyway, those are your two choices. And we looked at this in both ways. We looked at it parametrically, we looked at it non-parametrically, we had single output, multiple output, and this is kind of the one example of the type of non-parametric analysis that you could do to estimate efficiency. This is called data envelopment analysis, which is the non-parametric approach, which involves estimating a linear program. And essentially what you're doing is saying that the decision-making units, and in this context that would be, let's say, a university, is trying to maximize efficiency. And efficiency is defined as the ratio of outputs to inputs. And so you estimate this kind of, these efficiency scores, basically, they're scores, and they're bounded between 0 and 1. If a firm has an efficiency score of 1, it means it's on the frontier. If it has an efficiency score of less than 1, it means it's below the frontier and can do better. You can see how this would be of great value, and it is. And this technique has been applied in many, many contexts to measure and explain efficiency. And that's what I mean in terms of what we did was do a two-stage analysis where we estimated the scores and then tried to explain them using the factors that I mentioned earlier, institutional, environmental, and organizational. Another approach is called stochastic frontier estimation, which is a parametric approach where you estimate efficiencies based on residuals from regressions and then try to explain the residuals. And you do that in the same kind of way. What's good about the parametric approach, of course, is that you can do statistical inference. You have the benefit of doing your statistical inference. And you can make some, you test hypotheses in a more rigorous way as a result. That's with single output. With multiple outputs, you can, again, use the same approach, both statistical and non-statistical, non-parametric, using distance functions. And in this context, what you're doing is measuring, now you have multiple outputs, right? Not a single output, let's say licensing and startups, and you have a frontier, and you are estimating the distance to the frontier. And a firm that has a positive distance is inefficient. Not a firm. That was a Freudian slip, by the way. A university. Usually this is applied to firms. But you are estimating the distance to the frontier. So again, these are some of the approaches that we used and other researchers have used to estimate the effectiveness or the efficiency of universities in transferring technologies. And again, I'm not going to go through all the different approaches. There are lots of studies here. I'm just going to try to summarize what I think the key findings are of this literature. Both the quantitative results and then the qualitative results, because I think we get different findings from those studies. The first is that production function models fit very well. So regardless of the context, whether it's universities, mostly this has been done at the university level or department level, whether it's done domestically, globally, you find that the models fit very well. So this framework is very useful. And it doesn't matter whether it's all the results that I will mention apply in the single output case or in the multiple output case. So it's not very sensitive to the, how many outputs you try to estimate. One key stylized fact which emerges from the literature is that staff in the technology transfer office are adding significant value. Now, I am not a person who would normally argue that universities are understaffed in general with administrators, but this is one area where we actually need more staff, I think, is in the technology transfer office. These technology transfer offices are true boundary spanners. And they play a very, very important role in facilitating and fostering technology commercialization, and they are adding value. That's what the studies show. There is no strong consensus on returns to scale. In non-economies, what that means is that there's no real sense that larger universities have an advantage relative to smaller universities. However, it does appear as though private universities have a significant advantage relative to public universities. And I would argue that that's because they have more flexibility in changing their intellectual property policies, as it relates to the faculty especially, and that they can be more nimble and in that regard. Also, universities with medical schools and that have a very strong presence in the biomedical sphere also appear to be more productive. So that is a major advantage. And that's not surprising because the commercialization potential is greater in that area than in some other fields, scientific fields. We just published a special issue of Research Policy, which I think confirms this. But Bayh-Dole-like legislation across countries, not just in the US, but across the planet, appears to have been effective in stimulating technology commercialization. So there's no turning back, I think, when it comes to this. And the findings are very, very robust in this area. There is some limited evidence, and we need more, by the way, that supports the idea that property-based institutions are adding value. We published 2 studies that showed that science parks make firms on science parks more productive in their research and commercialization. That the firms that are located on those facilities tend to be more productive in their research and more effective in their commercialization. And we have some incubator studies that also find the similar results. Incentives matter. Certainly, there have been several papers that have shown that royalty distributions matter. That is, what percentage of the royalties are allocated to the faculty tends to be important in terms of stimulating commercialization and academic entrepreneurship. But organizational practices really matter just as much, and other institutional policies. And I'll talk about some of those in the remainder of my talk. Universities are becoming more strategic in technology transfer. This is not surprising because this is a relatively embryonic field. For many universities, this is new territory, and they haven't really had a long experience in confronting this as a strategic issue, and I'll talk about that as well. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the strategies that universities are formulating and implementing in this arena. And interestingly, we just did a conference at Johns Hopkins University in April, which convened the technology transfer directors at the major research universities in the US with the academics who are studying this process. And what was really heartening to me was to see that the technology transfer directors were applying management theories to their operation. They were saying, okay, we're going to take these management theories and really apply it in the context of our universities, because we believe that they will have favorable outcomes. So it's really having an influence. The academic literature is having an influence on practice. And I saw that with my own eyes at this workshop. Universities, the other trend that we're seeing is that when universities started out in this arena, they tended to be focused on patenting and licensing and the blockbuster licensing deals. But in recent years, universities are increasingly focused on the entrepreneurial dimension of technology commercialization. And there's some mixed evidence on the success of university-based startups, whether they tend to be more successful. My research has shown that they are, but there are other studies that show that university-based startups encounter several problems. But it's clear that universities are focusing more on this dimension. And I think that's a good thing, and I'll talk about the implications of that educationally and in other ways. Fundraising, which is critical for universities, especially universities that are getting, really experiencing diminishing support from governments, need to rely more on these kinds of sources of funding. One very interesting finding, which is contrary to the so-called popular wisdom that we hear, is because one of the concerns about academic entrepreneurship that we hear all the time is, well, this is taking faculty away from their basic research. This is bad. This is not a good thing for the university to be doing. Well, guess what? If you look at when you look at the published studies, we've had several in the Journal of Tech Transfer and other journals, what you find is just the opposite. What you find is that academic entrepreneurs are not less productive in their research. Even academics who started companies stay active in research. And this is not surprising to me, because when we visited academic entrepreneurs and interviewed them, you could see how proud they were of their laboratories. They were prouder of their laboratories than they were of their families, really. They just plowed back the revenue into the labs, into better equipment, more postdocs, and really used the money to increase the quality of the science that they were doing. And because that's what drives them, is discovery and again, so it wasn't surprising to me based on the qualitative work, but it was nice to see that confirmed in the quantitative, very rigorous empirical evidence that confirms that. I just published a paper which had a very interesting result as it relates to immigration policy. What we found, we were trying to measure the propensity of academics to be entrepreneurial, is that foreign-born academics were more likely to be entrepreneurial than domestic academics. This has implications for those regions and those states that want to promote academic entrepreneurship and develop clusters around universities to have a more open immigration policy as it relates to scientists and engineers. So this implies that having a more open, if you want to stimulate academic entrepreneurship, some regions want to do this, some universities want to do this, it helps to have a more open academic policy. Another result that is very, very critical when it comes to the stimulation of academic entrepreneurship is the role of the social network. And this has been documented by great sociologists like Woody Powell and others, and his kind of whole army of graduate students and junior faculty now, that social networks matter. And that if you want to attract star scientists, and many universities and regions are working very aggressively to promote star scientists, the returns to doing so are very high, because when you get the star scientists, you also get the social network that they have access to. Now, the qualitative research. I think the qualitative research has been very important because it's helped us identify what I would consider to be the three major impediments to effectiveness in technology commercialization. The first is the existence of informational and cultural barriers between the university and firms. This is especially problematic for small firms. We've seen that. The university traditionally has courted the large companies, not the small entrepreneurial firms. So this is a major change in their culture to have to deal with entrepreneurial firms, startups, and in particular, startups. And that needs to be considered. Second, insufficient rewards for academic entrepreneurship is a major, major impediment. Faculty do not have sufficient incentives to be engaged in this. And here I refer to both pecuniary incentives and non-pecuniary incentives. So partly it has to do with royalty distribution formulas and how much money they make, essentially, from this activity. But I think what is even more important is promotion and tenure. Being acknowledged for doing these kinds of activities also needs to be addressed. Third, what can be done to improve the quality of the human capital and the, I guess, the returns to the human capital at the university that is allocated to this, mostly in the technology transfer office? And this really relates to improving HRM practices in the technology transfer function, reducing turnover, professionalization of technology transfer, providing technology transfer officers with the right kinds of background, hiring the ones with the right kind of business experience, entrepreneurial experience, who can interact. Again, this is a very, very tough job. You have to be a boundary spanner as a technology transfer officer. You have to be able to communicate with academics who live in their own world, who have their own norms and standards and values. You have to communicate with university administration. That's another bizarre world, right, where people have different objectives and norms and standards and values. And then you have to interact with firms and entrepreneurs who are impatient to get their products to the marketplace, are interested in financial returns. And you have to speak those three languages. And this is very, very difficult. And I think that the HR practices have to be addressed, really have to think about that very seriously. Because this is a very important function for the university, if they choose to emphasize it. And then finally, there is a great need for education and training of faculty members, postdocs, all of those who are involved in the research enterprise, at the university, and you all represent research universities, so you know this, how to deal with entrepreneurs, how the entrepreneurial process works, how to interact with the business community. There are major flaws in the current state of affairs as it relates to the university's understanding of how to interact with industry.